and welcome everyone to this exciting conversation tonight. But first, I'd like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. This is our Leaders in Communications series, which is a monthly speaker series that brings media leaders, influencers, and newsmakers to the Newhouse School for candid and insightful conversations with students and other guests. With a special emphasis on current trends and challenges, this series helps students keep a pace of a quickly changing communications industry and provides them with a connection to the professions that you will eventually lead. The series also offers valuable networking and learning opportunities as guests visit classrooms or student organizations, in addition to participating in the public conversation. The series is supported by the Hearst Speakers Fund. And tonight we are excited to welcome Debra Adams Simmons with us tonight, who is rounding out what I think has been a busy day today here at the Newhouse School. An experienced journalist and media leader, Debra Adams is the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for National Geographic Media, where she works across the Walt Disney Company, which is Nat Geo's parent company, on strategic diversity initiatives. She's spent the past several years as Executive Editor, History and Culture at National Geographic. Debra previously was Managing Editor and Editor of The Plain Dealer in Cleveland before joining its parent company, Advanced Local, as a Vice President, and she has extensive reporting, editing, and senior management experience at multiple platforms, including the Akron Beacon Journal, the Virginian Pilot, the Detroit Free Press, the Hartford Courant, and the Syracuse Herald Journal. She's a graduate of the Newhouse School, where she was one of our 50 forward, recognized as part of the school's 50th anniversary celebration. She's also a graduate of the College of Arts and Sciences, where she co-chairs the Dean's Advisory Board and recently spearheaded an endowed scholarship effort for Black and Hispanic students. She will be interviewed tonight by Rockell Brown Burton, our new Associate Dean of Inclusivity, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility. So we're very happy to have Debra, have you here with us tonight. And Rockell, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Welcome everyone, thank you. Feel free to come down a little closer if you like, but if you don't, that's fine. So thank you for being here, Debra. So I'm so excited to have this opportunity to share with you and to learn from you. And so I want to start off by asking, how does it feel to be back at Newhouse?
Thank you so much for the warm introduction, and the welcome today has been fantastic. The weather was mild, which you don't always get in October in Syracuse, and the welcome has just been very gracious, so it feels great to be back. I'm really impressed with how sophisticated the building is. Not that it wasn't sophisticated 30-ish years ago, but just to see how things have evolved and to see the energy of the students and the the intensity of the programs. It's just great to be back.
Okay, well, we're happy to have you back. So you have a new position now.
I do.
Can you tell us about that?
So a few weeks ago, I was named Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, but it's really an extension of the work that I have been doing at National Geographic since I arrived there. As fate would have it, in a past life, I had been the editor and managing editor of The Plain Dealer in Cleveland, Ohio, and the editor who I worked with in Cleveland became the editor-in-chief some jobs later of Nat Geo. And when she was interested in doing a project on race, she felt like she didn't have the right team in the room, and so she invited me to be a consultant because I wasn't in a position to move at the time. And a few weeks into the consultancy, she was like, do you think you can just join the staff? And that was the beginning of my journey at National Geographic. And my goal for that assignment and for the work that I have done since is really to do authentic storytelling and to pay close attention to the stories that we're telling and who gets to tell those stories. And so that's where my emphasis as an editor had been since I joined the team. And that's the work that continues. Whose story are we telling? Who gets to tell the story? Who's on the staff? Who are our contributors? Who do we want our contributors to be? and how can we put the most authentic frame on the storytelling that we're doing. So for example, in 2015, only about 3% of the stories that National Geographic does were written by women. In 2020, 55% of the stories are written by women. And those data points continue if you look at different sort of racial groups or what have you. And so we like to make the point that, you know, we're not your grandfather's National Geographic, even though I meet people and they say, my grandparents have this in their attic, or they keep these in the basement. We want to make the point that, you know, we have moved into the 21st century. If you look at National Geographic's Instagram, it's the largest media brand on Instagram at about 140 million. If you don't have Nat Geo's Instagram on your phones, I encourage you to look at it. And we are really telling the stories of people around the world. So even though we're modernized, some of the legacy of Nat Geo continues, and you know, we continue to have distinctive visual storytelling. We continue to travel the human journey of people in countries around the world. The print magazine exists in about 45 languages, and so we are living in the moment, but we're also holding true to the best parts of the legacy.
That's wonderful. Well, I am curious about your current role, and if you are the first person in this position, or did you have a predecessor, and if not, how did this, you know, if you are the first person, how did this role come about?
Well, interestingly enough, I was the history and culture editor, and DEI was my side gig in the organization, and so we kind of flipped it. So DEI is now my main gig, but if there's a great history and culture story in the room, I will be the person who makes sure that happens. So, you know, National Geographic, like other media organizations, are you know, trying to rise to meet the moment. Clearly paying attention to the work that we're doing is key. Making sure we have a diverse team is key. Making sure we have inclusive storytelling and inclusive representation are all critically important to Nat Geo as well as the Walt Disney Company. And so this is National Geographic's way to try to make sure that they are investing in the work that we think is critical.
Wonderful. I am curious to know, you've had such a lengthy career, and you've lived in different places and worked for different organizations. How would you look at that journey over time and the work that you're doing now? How has the emphasis of the landscape evolved as during your career when it comes to DEI?
So one of the points that I made earlier is that my journey wasn't necessarily the journey that I thought I might have the week that I graduated from college. And I'll just tell this little story. You know, upon graduation, like many college graduates, I didn't know exactly what I would be doing. About a week after I graduated from college, however, I was offered a postgraduate internship at what was then the Syracuse Herald Journal, which was the sister paper to the Post Standard. It was going to be a 9-month internship. I was going to do that during the academic year, take the summer off, travel to Africa and Europe, and then start law school the following year. 2 weeks into my postgraduate internship, the managing editor of the paper offered me a full-time permanent job. And the rest, as they say, is history. 35 years later, I'm still in the industry. During my first year, I did a huge project on abuses of children in foster care. It won some huge New York State awards. Onondaga County changed several of the practices. And so I really jumped in and made what I thought was an impact early, doing a story that was focused on accountability. And that really was the beginning of my professional journey. And clearly the students, the children who were in foster care were underrepresented. I mean, there weren't necessarily voices representing their experiences. And so really, I would say from the very beginning of my career, I was focused on amplifying voices of those who didn't necessarily have an opportunity to speak for themselves. I ultimately left the newspaper in Syracuse and went to the Hartford Courant, which happened to be my hometown paper. Stayed there for a few years and went to the Detroit Free Press, and continued on to a number of other news organizations, ultimately becoming the editor of the Cleveland Plain Dealer, which, by the way, is an advanced publications newspaper, which is the Newhouse family newspaper. I left Cleveland and went to Advanced Publications, and so Steve Newhouse was one of my bosses, and so I felt like my professional career had gone full circle from being a student in the Newhouse school to working for Steve Newhouse himself. Ultimately, after many years on that path, I did a fellowship at Harvard, and at the end of the fellowship is when I went to National Geographic. So I think many things contributed to my DEI perspective. The jobs that I've had, the places that I've worked, the people I've met along the way, the stories that I did, the beats that I had. I covered education for a long time, particularly in the Detroit public schools as a young writer. And you see the challenges and opportunities. And so as a journalist, you think, what stories can I do that can move the needle here, that can make a difference, that can improve the quality of education? And so really, I feel like several decades into my career, I'm fortunate to be in a position where I can select the stories that I think we need to pay attention to, or I can assign other people to do those stories. And I think this DEI role gives me an opportunity to amplify new voices.
Well, I commend you because I started off as a journalism major, and I wanted to tell stories. I wanted to do what you ultimately ended up doing, but I didn't see anyone that looked like you when I was a college student, with the exception of Susan Taylor with Essence, Oprah Winfrey, and then I didn't even know Paula Madison, at the time. So and I've shared this with students since I've been here, I made a decision not to go into journalism because I didn't feel confident that I would be able to amplify those voices and tell the stories I wanted to tell. I just didn't have a trust of the institution of media. Mm-hmm. So I commend you for enduring, because I do say enduring and thriving, not just enduring but thriving in, it's still historically a male-dominated profession and career, and so to rise into the ranks of leadership is quite a feat. So I want to know, in your experiences, what have been some pivotal moments or paradigm shifts or change agent moments that you can identify throughout your career in terms of DEI and news coverage?
Well, I would say perhaps every moment in my career has been a DEI moment, because particularly in the 80s and the 90s, there weren't that many women senior leaders. When I became the editor of the Plain Dealer, I think there were 2 black women editors in the country. 2 black women executive editors in the country. That was in the 2010. We're not talking, 40 years ago. We're talking not that many years ago. And so, it's an opportunity. It's also a burden. And journalism is a job as the top editor that you do in a fishbowl. So all your mistakes are on display. All the decisions that you have to make in an instant because you're covering news that you might make differently when you think back on them. I did a session with some students a couple months ago, and I was kind of cringing at some of the choices. Like, ooh, if I had to do that, this decision that I made 15 years ago, it seemed like the right thing to do at the time, but I'm not so sure now. But because you're the first or you're the only. It often gets perceived in a DEI context, and that can be a pro or a con. From where we sit now, I'm hoping to smooth the path for the people in this room. So, as Kamala Harris said, I might be the first, but I won't be the last. I think that holds true in every job in media today. When you look at digital media, sometimes I see some of the same mistakes that legacy media made being repeated in the digital media space. And so, one of the hats I wear is not just in the organization where I work, but in the industry and across organizations in the industry, American Society of Magazine Editors, the News Leaders Association, which used to be the American Society of News Editors, the Associated Press Managing Editors. I think playing a leadership role in those organizations and driving home the point that we need diverse representation can create a more comprehensive media workforce that can address some of the issues that you referenced earlier.
Okay. Well, when you look back over your career and your experiences, what has been the role of mentorship for you as a mentee and a mentor?
I would say mentorship has been critical, and mentors don't always look like you. You made a point that you didn't see anybody who looked like you or early on. So for me, my perhaps one of my most important mentors was a white man named Barry Katz, who worked at the Syracuse Herald Journal, because he was convinced that I had the reporting chops to do the big project. And then and that big project ultimately won big awards, and he really was a champion for me. And then there have been mentors along the way. The reason that I got the job that I got at the Syracuse newspaper in the first place is because a dean in one of Syracuse University's colleges that was not an area where I was majoring in had a relationship with the editor of the paper here, and she put in a call on my behalf. And she continued to be a mentor for decades afterwards. And so I would say embrace your mentors, listen to your mentors, and also there are people who are mentors that you don't necessarily frame in that way. You don't necessarily consider them a mentor, but later in your career you learn how, or you realize how pivotal they were to the steps that you have taken. So I think there are mentors, particularly when you're young, who sort of guide you, but then I think there are also peer mentors who sort of bolster you along the way, help you navigate the tough moments. I have a mentor group of women editors, Black, white, and Latino women who sort of lean on each other for support. And then the more senior you get, the fewer mentors you have and the more mentoring you do. So I'm kind of like the Pied Piper. I attract new people along the way. I already have picked out some people who I met with earlier today who are going to be my new my new cohort of mentees. But I also think you have different mentoring relationships with different people. So for some people it might be very specifically career focused. For some, it may be sort of counseling them through whether or not they should go back to school. For some, it might be navigating work-life balance, and is now a good time to embrace a new position or step back because of young children or whatever the case may be. So I feel like I have been mentored and have been a mentor. One of my most important mentors was the managing editor and then the editor of the Detroit Free Press, who was one of the first Black men to be the editor of a paper. His name was Bob Magruder, and he was a gentle giant. He was this big man who was really gentle, really thoughtful, an amazing journalist who had confidence in me when I didn't necessarily have confidence in myself, who really sort of pushed me to embrace new opportunities. And then he was like, are you sure you want to embrace all these opportunities? Because I'm not ready for you to leave our organization. But he continued to be a mentor after that. So I hear from a lot of students that they have a hard time finding mentors or developing mentoring relationships. And I would just say, it does take some work, but relationships also sort of evolve as you put time in and put work in. And so sometimes the formally assigned mentorship programs don't work as well as the professor who you go to for advice, who you keep going to for advice after you graduate, who ends up becoming a life mentor.
So now I want to dive into something a little bit. When you were a student, what were your experiences in terms of getting the experience that you desired or needed as a practitioner? Even, I know you said you thought you were going to take some time off and go to law school, but while you were a student as a BDJ major, what were some of the things you participated in, any student media outlets?
So I was kind of an activist. So for the activists in the room, it's okay. There's life that runs in parallel with that. But I'm saying that only half jokingly. I was very active on campus, but my participation spanned the gamut. I worked at Bird Library. I worked in the Child and Family Studies School, which is now Falk. I was the editor of the Black Voice magazine, which was a literary magazine at that time. It has evolved over the years. I was active in student government. I was the vice president of what was then the Student Afro-American Society. I guess it's the Black Student Union now. I was a member of Delta Sigma Theta sorority. So I had many campus interests, but I also did a television internship. Because I was a broadcast major and digital wasn't a thing in the 80s, such as it is. I had a television news internship. I had a newspaper internship. I wrote magazine stories, and so I had a lot of different sort of traditional journalism experiences that weren't necessarily required at the time in the way that many schools require them now. But I didn't necessarily know those things were gonna need to be packaged in a bow to be presented for a job. I was a broadcast journalism major, but I'm an introvert. Maybe you all can tell that I'm an introvert. And so I didn't really want to be in front of the camera. But I didn't know what the behind-the-scene ideal job necessarily would be. And so I wasn't a newspaper major, and that major did exist at the time. But because I had a strong writing background, that really created a path for me. So one of the things I told a small group when we met earlier is just make sure you got the fundamentals down. Because in this industry, if you can write, there are many jobs that can potentially be opened up for you.
One of the reasons I asked that question is because I'm new here, new to Newhouse, and been spending time talking to students, visiting classes, and having just some informal sessions with students, and particularly in the conversations that I've had with students of color with regard to their experiences in working within student media organizations at Newhouse, is they feel a barrier, so to speak, and with regard to being included in their pitches, their story ideas, being given consideration. And so I'm wondering, and there's so many, there are a number of student media outlets within Newhouse, and then there's some I know that are external. But I'm curious about what your experience was like as a student. And I mean, I know this is a part of the conversation that we need to have, especially for our students that are navigating this currently. What did you have experiences like that in terms of feeling included? That when you wanted to share or vocalize perspectives, opinions, or potential story ideas, regardless of the outlet. What was your experience like in, based on what I just said, what would you advise the students that are, that may experience those frustrations? Because I would imagine or assume that you possibly also may have experienced that beyond Newhouse in your career.
Yeah, I probably experienced it more in my career than I did here.
Okay.
Quite frankly, we had, we had our own publications in the 80s. And so there was a lot of self-segregation in the 80s that I think continues now. And having one's own isn't a bad thing. It means that there are enough publications for us to all be able to have a place. So I would start there. As the editor of a Black literary magazine, my focus was on how can I make this the best that it can be. So I wasn't necessarily in the room sort of fighting to be represented in a different publication. That said, arguing to get one's pitch to the sort of head of the class is the reality of the industry that we're in. And so even though that wasn't my SU experience, certainly as a 20-year-old, a 25-year-old, a 30-year-old journalist in a room where there wasn't this attention to DEI that there is now, there's a lot of pushing that needs to happen. That said, I did have friends who were on the Daily Orange staff and who worked in Newhouse Media, who had very successful experiences. And so I don't know that the fights that I would point to as a student were necessarily Newhouse fights.
Right. Mm-hmm. And to be clear, I don't know if that they're necessarily Newhouse fights, but what would you suggest, or based on what you encountered in the industry?
So I don't know if people saw Cheryl Lee Ralph's. I don't know if you saw Cheryl Lee Ralph's Emmy acceptance speech. I can't sing, but if I could, I would start with that song.
Right.
And she basically talks about the sort of endurance that has been required of her to get to the stage where she is now. Mm-hmm. So I would say that students have to persevere. It's probably, a lot of what they are experiencing may not seem fair, but it's the reality that we live in. Mm-hmm. There's always a sort of caste system when you come in as a freshman, mm-hmm. and the seniors are running things, and race may or may not be a variable. You didn't point to that specifically.
Right.
But in journalism, you're always going to have to pitch stories.
Right. And
you're always going to have an audience that at least is somewhat ambivalent, or maybe even resistance. And I think that you've got to strategize, who do I need on my team? So one of the things that I did as a young writer was I would count the votes before going into the room and sell the idea beforehand. So when we got in the room, you knew the group that was going to be against you, but you had the group that was for you. And sometimes you can win those battles and sometimes not. The flip side, though, for me was sometimes getting assignments that I was convinced that I got because I was the young Black girl in the room.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
And for those, if you're the youngest person on the staff, you don't necessarily have the power or the authority to push back, but you do sort of strategize about how I might handle this situation if it comes up again, or what I might do differently. So I can think about being in some frigid Syracuse weather, or covering a fire, or covering an outdoor event while my colleagues were back at the office nice and warm and cozy, and sort of wondering, why did I get this assignment? Was there, was it because I'm young? Was it because I'm a Black woman? Mm-hmm. What are the variables? But I don't think you can sort of stay there. You have to sort of acknowledge the moment, think about how you want to react to the moment, come up with some strategies, reach out to your mentors, talk to people who've walked that path before, try to come up with some solutions. Be creative, be clever. Talk to me if anybody's having this. I probably have lived through some of these experiences, and so, really figure out who your team is, who your network of support is, to help you navigate the situations. And I would say that on campus as well.
Right.
If people feel like they're being sort of cut off from opportunities, who can make a difference? Who can sort of challenge whatever the status quo is? Who can break up the system that is giving a particular group the opportunities?
I want to shift to something because now
Okay.
you are a leader. That means, I would imagine, you hire people. You look at a
Yes.
lot of resumes. What are some things that are there any patterns or themes or trends that you're noticing that are good, or that, our students need to be mindful of, or pitfalls not to make as they begin the journey of trying to sell themselves to an employer?
Well, one of the things, I think this really starts in high school. One of the things I notice is that students have these shiny resumes that check all of these boxes, but then that next layer of depth isn't always there.
Right.
And so for me, I'd rather see fewer things that one has done and some more significant clips or videos or examples of the work, depending on the kind of job that it is. And so, the idea, and I think this starts when students are applying for college, and there's particularly depending on the kind of school you go to. They say you've got to have, you got to have a nonprofit thing, and you've got to have these, multiple internships, and you have to have sort of, raise some philanthropic dollars, and you have to have done all of these things. And I'm like, yes, those things are important, but what kind of journalist is a candidate going to be? What
Right.
kind of stories are they interested in? Whose voices have they amplified? What stories have they told? What kind of listener are they? What kind of work habits are they going to bring to bear? Is this going to be a person that we want to spend time, a lot long hours in this industry, working together? Or in this sort of, post-COVID reality, how well might this person work independently if they aren't in a space with a lot of other people?
Right.
And so I am interested in a resume that is more nuanced than having lots of things on
Right.
it. That said, I was really impressed with the resumes, I guess it's the public relations students whose resumes are on a kiosk
Oh,
out in the
wow.
hall.
Okay.
I'm like, oh my goodness. I see some smiling. Are you one of those people? I mean, those resumes were beautiful. They were comprehensive. Told you a lot about the students right out of the gate. And so when I look at these Syracuse resumes, particularly those that are on display, I don't know if some faculty members picked the very best ones.
Right.
They are a lot more appealing than some of the resumes that I see. And then I don't know if you were in the room earlier when I talked about there being a whole group of resumes that just are not well put together.
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
I don't know what the situations might be at some
Right.
schools where that's the case,
Yeah.
but I think sometimes students have a hard time gathering their experiences into
Right.
a neat bow. Newhouse has that down.
Right. Good.
But, which creates an advantage. And I would say that the National Geographic staff has a lot of young Newhouse alum,
Oh, wow.
particularly in our photo editing department. And so I do think the work that is happening here and the internship opportunities that students here are getting is opening doors, not just at Nat Geo, but beyond.
So you've a phrase that you've said several times that I want you to talk more about: amplifying voices. Earlier today, I was really appreciative of what you said when we were in a smaller group about people, that there being diversity in spaces that we don't often think about or recognize. So I want to, share with the students and share with us about what Amplifying Voices means to you and what you've done in that space.
Yeah, I'm looking for the student who, so one of the points a student raised earlier was that when they think about National Geographic, they think about nature and they feel like that's a white space. And my response was, National Geographic isn't only nature, but even if you look at nature, nature isn't reserved for, a particular group. And one of the things the Christian Cooper Central Park scenario exposed many people to is that, yes, there are Black people who are interested in birding or who are interested in the outdoors. I reference an organization called Outdoor Afro, which is a national organization of multiple chapters of Black people who are interested in outdoor adventure.
Mm-hmm.
But that was a metaphor for this idea that it's important from where I sit at National Geographic and for journalists everywhere to not put groups in boxes. And so there's been a lot of talk recently, for example, about the Little Mermaid. Well, there is a group called the Mahogany Mermaids that we're getting ready to do a story on. That is a group of African American women marine biologists. And so National Geographic covers these areas, and I think it's important for us to show the people in these areas. There's a Black archaeology group. We've spent a lot of time focusing on, Black divers who are searching for slave wrecks. In fact, National Geographic invested the dollars that led to the discovery of Clotilda, which was the last known slave ship to come into the United States. We've also spent an extensive amount of time, energy, and resource writing about the descendants, the families of the people who were on Clotilda. If you look at it from an archaeological perspective, that isn't necessarily a space that that particular person would say is a diverse space, but we're here to say that it is in fact a diverse space, and that we think our storytelling needs to reflect the comprehensive group of people in any particular subject, be it adventure, animals, science, environment. These are all subjects that are important to National Geographic. And there are people of color, Black and brown people, indigenous people who are active in those spaces, and our work needs to reflect their experiences.
I've shared with you, that's a topic that's close to me, the Clotilda, last slave ship that arrived on the shores of the U.S., landed in Mobile, Alabama, which is my hometown. And so to see now national attention and hopefully now international attention given to that community that experienced, for lack of better words, secondary marginalization even within the Black community, and to learn that story regarding the fear around being able to openly acknowledge that you were a descendant, before fear of that, I still call it sacred ground, being, destroyed. And knowing the geography and knowing what I grew up around with the Plateau community is just mind-blowing, and really it's a barrel of mixed emotions because of the context, the historical context surrounding it, the current state of that community, and the environmental racism that they're having to contend with as a result of that. But I think that the work and the investment that Nat Geo has put into that is just something that I fully appreciate. And I'm curious to know what kind of responses and feedback you all receive or have been receiving as you do more of these types of stories that are more representative of the full human experience, in the U.S. and abroad.
So one thing I want to say about the last question, then I'll come back to this one. I think one of the reasons we perceive spaces as being white spaces is because we've never seen people who weren't white in those spaces.
Yes.
And so part of my responsibility is to show everyone who the other people are in these spaces that you've never seen before. And so when we talk about Clotilda, and we talk about the underwater archaeology part of it, it would be easy enough to focus on that one, white man who's made his life mission to get to the bottom of the Mobile River to find that ship. But it's also important to talk about the black scuba divers who did the heavy lifting that helped make that happen. And so now we're getting lots of attention because Netflix has recently, released the movie Descendants, and so it's now in the popular discourse.
Yes.
But when we started working on this 5 years ago, people didn't know about Clotilda, and I would say the same thing about Tulsa.
Yes.
Like everyone knows the story of Tulsa now, but 5 years ago that wasn't so common. Until Watchmen came out, most people hadn't heard, including our peers, not just young people, were not familiar with the history of Tulsa. So we have invested a lot of time doing that work, getting lots of great feedback from some segment of the community, while others would like Nat Geo to be what it was. And so I think a lot of media is wrestling with how do you appeal to new audiences while also holding on to your base. But even more, the response to Nat Geo's gender issue was even more intense than anything we've done on race. National Geographic did a cover story in January 2017 where a transgender girl was featured on the cover, and thousands of people canceled their subscriptions. And so one response might have been to say, okay, well, we're going to sort of backtrack because we don't want to alienate the audience. But our position was the exact opposite. And we feel like those are voices that need to be amplified, and we can do it in an objective way. We're not on a side. We just want to tell the sort of complete story of the lived experiences of people whose stories don't get told. And so that's what we did. And then the next layer of that is enabling people to tell their own stories. And so when we talk about amplifying voices, it's like, who can we get in this community who can write a story? So, for example, we have done quite a bit of work across Africa and Asia, looking at the empowerment of women, and we found women in those communities and from those countries to tell their stories. We're getting ready to do a special issue on Nigeria related to the population crossing the 8 billion number, and several African countries are where the population is growing the fastest. So journalistically, it makes sense for the Nigeria to be one of the places, and we're going to have a Nigerian writer write that story. And that's not to say that you have to, only people from a place can be the writer, but why not give an opportunity to bring some authenticity to our storytelling?
Oh, I love that. Before we open up for questions, I do want to ask, what's your proudest moment as a journalist, or what are several highlights that stick with you, that you're proud of being a part of, stories that you have been able to amplify? There's
so many. I mean, in 35 years, it's hard to, I can't even believe that it's been 35 years. It's hard to point to just one. There have been a number of stories that held government accountable that would be on that list. There are a number of stories that I have been able to be a part of where I could ultimately see myself. Interestingly enough, a few years ago, National Geographic did a story about HBCUs, and it was the first story of that kind in that publication. And for me, that was a pivotal moment because it represented change. And so I would say each big story represents something significant. And there have been so many. I have to, even though knew this question might be coming, I've had a hard time
It's always hard.
zeroing in on that one thing. I've won a number of big awards, and clearly, the awards that sort of acknowledge the work would be at the top of that list. But there have been all kinds of things. There have been stories about people. There's been stories about animals. I mentioned earlier that I edited a story about U.S. tigers, and I was like, I'm not the animals writer. Why am I editing this? But because I had a hard news background, I inherited that story, which ultimately focused on the fact that there are fewer than 10,000 tigers remaining in the U.S. because they've been so abused, and that led to U.S. Fish and Wildlife changing some of their regulations. And so there's stories like that, but then there's just stories that are beautiful poetry that are also equally important. We did an amazing profile of Aretha Franklin's life. And I worked at the Detroit Free Press for a number of years, and so and we got an authentic Detroit writer to tell that story, and so that was important as well. So I think there have been any number of stories that I feel passionately about.
Well, we are ready to open up for questions. Yes, is that you, Jordan? Okay.
One story I did was about the, while you're thinking about your question, was about the history of Delta Sigma Theta and the women's suffrage movement, which was a story that we did in 2020 as part of our 100th anniversary coverage. And so that one was another one that was near and dear. So there are different stories for different reasons.
Yes, Jordan. Oh, what she has, the microphone is right here. Oh, you're not Jordan?
No, I'm not.
Okay, I can't see.
Good evening, Ms. Simmons. My name is Cyrus Henry. I'm a master's student in the Public Diplomacy and Global Communications program. Thank you for joining us this evening. My question for you is, being a woman of color in the industry, I can assume that you've had many challenges throughout your career. So being so, what's a challenge you face and how did you overcome it?
What's a challenge I face?
Yes.
Oh, there have been so many challenges. I guess an important sort of broad and consistent challenge is being overlooked even when you're in the room. And so there are lots of conversations about, we've got to be in the room, we have to have a seat at the table. But there was a time in my career when I had a seat at the table, sort of on paper, but if the room isn't acknowledging your contributions, that can be particularly frustrating. And when you're not the top editor, you can't force the change. You really got to sort of negotiate the change, and you got to sell the change, and you got to get people to buy into your ideas. And over years and years, that can be frustrating, which is why being strategic and developing a team and doing some politicking, which is one of the points I was making earlier, sort of counting the votes before going in the room, helps you get the sort of acknowledgement that you deserve. So one of the things I try to do now, having been in that position, is make sure that the people who are in the room now get the floor and get the respect and get the support that I didn't necessarily feel like I had.
I'm so glad you said that, because that is one of the biggest, can be a tremendous frustration, because, and I think that's why we've seen the wording expand for diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, because for so long we've been focused on diversity and satisfied with numbers and presence. But if those voices and those individuals are in the room or at the table and their voice is not given space, that's how we continue to have that problem. So I'm so glad you brought that up.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Where are you from?
Connecticut. I'm Kimberly Givenson.
Oh, nice to meet you.
Hi, Ms. Simmons. My name is Andrea Rosotes, and I'm a freshman studying public relations and policy studies. My question for you is, what was your biggest motivator, especially when you went to a PWI, obviously Syracuse University?
My biggest motivator
Yes.
during college,
Yes.
graduating. So interestingly enough, I feel like my biggest support system though was the communities I created while I was here, or that were created for me. And so I mentioned earlier, for example, when I was a freshman, I lived in Sadler.
Oh, I live in South Bay.
And interestingly enough, one of my dearest friends today is somebody who lived in Sadler as a freshman. And so, you know, interestingly enough, Syracuse was pretty diverse even in the 80s. And we had this diverse community who lived in the same dorm. I had another friend who lived in Flint. And, you know, the people who live up there, they have their own community. And so that was sort of creating a space. As a Newhouse student, I had a Newhouse community, a diverse Newhouse community, and that was a space. You know, I'm in a sorority, so that was a space. And so I think having 3 or 4 different communities within the university gave me the sort of support and motivation I needed when the weather got really bad, or we didn't have any money, or whatever the situation might be. What y'all laughing about up there? Oh, okay. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but you know, I think sort of embracing the moment, right? We're here, the weather might be a little funky, but we can do some amazing things. It's a great setting. The Syracuse network in Newhouse particularly, is significant. I feel like I can call somebody at any media organization in the country and there's a Newhouse alum in the room who will open a door. And so I think that's what you all have going for you, that you need to really embrace and lean into. And that network is a lot more diverse 40 years later than it was before. And so I think that's the answer.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to know what y'all were chuckling about back there.
No.
Hello, Ms. Simmons. We spoke a little earlier today as well. You had mentioned a little earlier, and Ms. Burton actually praised you for your ability to go into a field, but not only a field, but a world in which you didn't see people that looked like you. So what would your advice be to someone who's looking to go into a field where they don't see individuals who look like themselves?
Identify a mentor who doesn't look like you. You know, get comfortable being in spaces where there may not be people who look like you. You know, develop relationships with people who don't look like you. And then be that person who looks the way you look for the next group that comes along. So I know that sounds easier said than done, but you know, and I think in media it's more diverse now, so there are fewer scenarios where you may be the only person, but to the extent that you are the only person, I think that you embrace mentors who have your best interest at heart,
Exactly.
even if they look differently. And I would say if you really feel like you need a mentor who does look like you, find somebody outside of that particular space that you're in. Maybe they're interested in what you're doing or doing what you want to do, but they're in a different state or different community. You know, find mentors who look like you outside of the space that you're in, but find some people who are different from you in that space. So don't limit yourself to, you know, to only being supported by somebody who has your same experiences, because I think there's value in learning from other people's experience as well.
I'm so glad you said that, because ironically, well, although I went to an HBCU as an undergraduate, my first mentor that really is, and is still a mentor, is a white man from the Midwest. And so, and that's, I definitely would say, those that gravitate towards you, that are wanting to help you, allow them to help, allow people to help you that want to help you. and be receptive to it, and because you don't know where that will take you.
And, particularly as you sort of move into the executive ranks, an executive champion is likely to be somebody who doesn't look like you. But an executive champion might also be somebody in the room who can move the rest of the room in your direction. And so I think that you have to think about relationships that are strategic and how they can be helpful. And if you think about your career as a chessboard, what's going to get you to, to the other side of the board?
Hello, Ms. Simmons. My name is Cecilia, and I'm a freshman studying magazine news and digital journalism. My question for you is, have you met editors or other journalists that have different journalistic missions than yourself, and how have you dealt with them?
So I feel like there's a question behind that question. I'm not sure what that is. The question was, have I met journalists who have different journalistic missions than my own? And
people that haven't supported your pitches for your school?
oh yeah, all the time. So what I would say is, I feel like every journalist I have met that I have encountered does at least have some similar core values of truth, honesty, accuracy, fairness. And we can have a whole debate about politics. This isn't that conversation. And so, and I feel like I've also encountered, for the most part, mutual respect and mutual understanding. So if you disagree with my pitch, but there's some mutual respect, we can agree to disagree, and I'll continue to advocate from my point of view. When I feel like the resistance is coming from a place of disrespect, I think that's a different situation that has to be confronted. And so I'm at this stage of my career where I will confront it. If I was having that conversation with somebody in the room, I would want to know a lot more about the scenario. What was the scenario? Tell me, who was in the room, what was said, what was the response? And I probably could offer some strategies for how you might respond to that. But I've heard a little bit of this theme about some students feeling like they aren't being heard. And so I would want to have a little huddle about what that looks like, and to be able to make some suggestions about how you respond. Who ultimately is responsible for the decision making, and is there an opportunity to go directly to that person and say, I feel like I'm not being heard? Call it out, and see what kind of response you can get to that. And the answer may be to walk away if you feel like you've challenged it multiple times and you haven't gotten an appropriate response.
Do we have any more questions?
I see one.
Yeah.
Samara from Clark Atlanta University. The highlight of my career.
And why?
And why? Really, the highlight of my life has been my two sons graduating from college. And so, I think there's highlights and there's highlights. So there's lots of stories and lots of work moments I could point to, but raising children and having two Black sons graduate from college in the 2020s, among the most challenging times in our history, is probably my most significant sort of life moment. And one of those sons went to college in Atlanta, and as fate would have it, both my sons graduated the same weekend. One from a small liberal arts college in Ohio, and one from Morehouse College in Atlanta. One day apart, and so we had to race to the airport in Cleveland to get the last flight to get down to Atlanta to be on campus at 7 a.m. the next day. And so it was a very intense weekend, and then we all went out to dinner at the end and had a family toast, and sort of lifting up that glass at the end was the moment. So I don't know if I've had any journalistic experiences that that align with that, but I've been involved in a number of powerful stories, including one from a woman in Cleveland who was on my staff, who was a theater critic, and she went to interview the person who ran this theater at a well-known college, and as she sort of walked through the theater and went to the stage where she was supposed to meet this professor, she was brutally attacked, and she carried this attack with her for 20 years, and ultimately did an 8-part series on being raped and brutalized while on assignment as this theater critic. You know, this man held a knife up to her throat and, you know, took her backstage, and it was this horrible experience, and it essentially ruined her life. Her husband also was a reporter at the paper, so they both were on the staff, and she decided to write about it, and the husband didn't really want the story told. So it was a traumatic experience. And it ended up being a cathartic experience for her. It explained a lot of things about her life. We partnered with the Rape Crisis Center. All these people came forward to tell their stories, and that was probably the most emotional story that I've ever been involved in. This woman actually went and found the family members of the man who attacked her. The sister of the man also had been raped in her life, so they had this whole bonding moment, and that was one of the pieces of this 8-part series. And it was an award-winning series, an incredible piece of journalism, and talk about amplifying voices. Like, how often do we hear rape victims tell their story in multiple parts? Wow. And somebody might say, "Oh, is that the story you picked as the, most impactful?" But it was just a powerful, powerful story. And so I can think of, I've been doing this for 35 years. I can think of a story a year that was the most powerful story that year. When I learned, so one of the interesting things National Geographic did in 2020 was create a resident program, which is like a post-grad sort of year-long internship. I encourage everybody in the room to apply for it. There are like 4 to 6 slots per year. And as we were embarking on the Tulsa story, one of the residents discovered that he was a Tulsa descendant, and not just a descendant. His grandfather was the richest black man in Tulsa, and the person they wanted to kill the most, who was able to escape. And so the emotional journey that he went on and reporting the story, just like as an assignment he didn't know, was pretty powerful. So there are all kinds of big and small examples.
Any other questions?
We might be at time, right?
Yes. I think we are at. You have a question? Can I ask? Yeah, one more. Yeah, sure.
Hi, I'm a student at Television, Radio, and Film program, and I'm curious. I probably have a few questions, but I think one of the major questions I have for you is, how do you make sure the diversity is in each project, and how do you make sure they are well protected mentally and physically whenever they are in the project? Because I think this is very important. And then also, it's not also, I'm just also curious, for this, how do I describe it? Department or organization, does it also protect the team, internationally for every project program that's also working for National Geography?
So you have multiple questions in there. For the physical protection, I'll say that the Walt Disney Company has a global compliance team. So for every story we plan, we have to submit a security plan to global compliance, and then they accept it or reject it. And if they reject it, you have to start over, or you have to augment the parts that need shoring up. And even then, they may say no. And so this is particularly important because I have a team in Yemen right now. I have a team in Afghanistan. I have a team in Syria. My request to send a team into Ukraine hasn't made it past global security right now. And it's a multi-part checklist, and they also do security assessments on the ground in every place that we want to be. So one of the residents who I was talking about, who's in this year's cohort, is taking a family trip to Baghdad next week, and we couldn't get authorization for him to represent the company while he's there. He could go with his family, but there wasn't support for him to go there to do a story. So I think the physical protection is locked down. Disney doesn't want to be liable. They want to make sure people are safe and that they, return from the trips they take. I think the question of, mental health is a harder question to answer because mental health isn't as obvious. You don't know what people's internal struggles are. We certainly try to offer counseling and support, but you don't always know who needs the counseling or who needs the support or what support is needed or what lived experience someone is bringing to an assignment. So I think that's more challenging. But I spend a lot of time talking to the people who I'm working with and, try to get a sense of when something's bothering them or when something might be off. But, people can be closed, so you don't always know those things. Mm-hmm. But we do a lot of heavy coverage, and so I try to check in with people, meet with them one-on-one. And I also try to meet people where they are, which makes them more comfortable if they're having a hard time to say. Are we recording still? Yeah. Okay, so there's a story that I would tell, but I don't necessarily want to have it on tape, but I'll give you another sort of partial story afterward. But I recently had someone on my staff live through a traumatic experience and, working through how to make that person whole, is a key part of what I'm doing right now. And then to the question of how do you ensure diversity? When stories get pitched, I'm like, who's telling the story? Who's shooting the photographs? Who's the assistant? Who's the editor? Who's the photo editor? And so making sure that the obvious roles represent a range of people is a key step. And we have a lot of roles. We have graphic artists, we have illustrators, you have the roles that you see, particularly the roles that are sort of in front of the camera whose names are on the story that are out front. But we have lots of behind the scenes people. We have a research team. Who is the researcher that's assigned to a project? And is there any diversity reflected there? So every team may not necessarily fit the optimum range of diversity, but we make an aggressive attempt to try to have at least some diversity in every situation. But for example, we do a lot of, we have an amazing photographer who takes pictures of whales and sharks underwater. And there aren't a lot of diverse underwater photographers. And so one of the things we're trying to do is cultivate our own. And so we have something called a second assistant program where somebody who has some photo experience and some underwater experience can get enough of both so they can assist him. So ultimately they'll be able to do their own project. We have people who shoot, animals, and the photographers who shoot animals in the middle of the night with traps and things like that. That's not the most diverse part of the work we do, and so there are steps that that we take to try to make sure those teams are balanced out.
Can I ask one more question?
Sure.
What's the future plan, or what's the next step for you to make sure that the diversity and inclusion is actually fulfilled in National Geography?
I think setting goals for one, so people can be clear about the expectations. In fact, that would be the number. You know, what gets measured gets done. So I think creating some expectations, creating some measurements, hiring a diverse team, hiring diverse contributors. Like, we didn't get from 3% women to 55% without having goals. We said this is what it's going to be. So, for example, on the cover of National Geographic in 2021, 5 of the 12 covers were produced by diverse contributors. That's significant for Nat Geo, that maybe the year before, in the sort of 20 years before, maybe there was 1 out of 12. And so that 5 represents 40%. That's you know, kind of a minimum place that we'd like to be. And so it's part of my job to make sure we're hiring the right people to get us there.
Well, thank you. Can we all give our alum a hand?
Thank you. Thank you for coming. And as I said to the earlier group, and some of you are in the room again, and even for the new people, please feel free to stay in touch. When I made the point about having lots of mentors and attracting new people in my sort of mentorship circle, I meant that. So if you just take my name, Debra.AdamsSimmons at natgeo.com, that's how you can find me. If you want to know how to spell my name, I think it's on the slide. I didn't realize that slide was up there for the whole time, but just stay in touch. If you're interested in photography and you want to meet a photo editor, if you are in DC and you're interested in a tour of Nat Geo, if you have a story idea you want to pitch. I met a student at NABJ this summer who just sent me a story pitch. She doesn't go to Syracuse University, goes to another school. And I've sent that pitch along. We're having a conversation about it, maybe massaging it a little bit. And so anybody can put a great story forward. And so I would encourage you to embrace that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Be safe. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.